What's up, everybody? Noble Comics here, and today we are looking to answer a question that is very near and dear to myself, and that is: do comic book movies influence comic book sales? Particularly when I was, going to do this, I was thinking about the MCU and Marvel comic sales because if you don't know, comic sales, American comic book sales, have been on a downward trend since like the mid 2000s, maybe around 2010. Been on a downward trend, even though the movies have just skyrocketed, and it's the most successful franchise of all time. Um, and so I was wondering, what's the correlation there? Is there any relationship at all between the movies themselves and the comics, and if there is or isn't, why? This does include, this data I have got does include more than just Marvel. It includes DC movies as well. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Here we go. So I've got myself off here to the other screen. You might see me looking over there. So what I have here are all Marvel and DC comic book movies, live action feature releases from 2000 to 2019. This data has been gathered from Comichron, which is the the site that chronicles all comic book sales to stores through Diamond Comics distribution. Now, the reason it goes to 2019 is because starting in 2020 with COVID, Diamond Comics no longer is the sole distributor of comic books in America. DC and Marvel both split off to different distributors, so the values that are presented there are no longer accurate. So, but up until then, we've got data, and I'm looking at a particular set of characters: Ant-Man, Aquaman, the Avengers, Batman, Black Panther, Captain America, Daredevil, Deadpool, Doctor Strange, Fantastic Four, Ghost Rider, Green Lantern, Guardians of the Galaxy, Hulk, Iron Man, Justice League, Punisher, Shazam, Spider-Man, Suicide Squad, Superman, Thor, Wolverine, Wonder Woman, and the X-Men. We're going to be looking at month-to-month sales, which is what I have here under comic sales. Oops. We've got total sales for that month. We've got, of course, the date over here. The Marvel and DC variables. This is, I guess I should explain. We are in our studio to run this regression on comic book sales, and we're using a fixed effects method because this is panel data, doing a fixed effects, which means that we are looking at mostly dummy variables, either a 1 or a 0. The Marvel and DC here didn't actually factor in correctly. I know it's because I've got two columns that are mutually add up to each other, right? But even when I did just one, I still wasn't getting it to populate right. So just ignore that for now. But what we're going to be regressing on is going to be how our comic sales are affected by whether or not a movie released, whether or not the movie was a sequel, whether it was a reboot, whether it had a Rotten Tomatoes audience score at 70 or above. So that's all kind of movie related. Then comic book related, I had was the issue a number one issue, and was it a milestone issue, as in like issue number 200, 400, something like that. A few things that I did not include in this that could be included in a future regression would be creative teams. Like, for example, Batman sales under Scott Snyder are going to be higher than Batman sales under Tom King, for example. But I did not take into account creative teams. That would be like a whole other headache. I did not take into account alternate titles for the same character. So, like, if there's 5 different X-Men comics, I took the comic that I thought would be the most baseline for that character. Like, if you were coming into a comic book store blind and you said, "I want to read X-Men," what would be handed to you? So, like, for Spider-Man, for the most part, it was Amazing Spider-Man. I'm not doing like Spider-Man, Peter Parker, or any of that stuff. Um, could be included to factor into total sales, but for the purpose of this, I did not. And as for titles that had multiple comics that were very close to each other, like, for example, Wolverine, I think later on, there was like the Wolverine, and then there was Old Man Logan, whose sales, like, one month, maybe one was higher than the other. I just try to stay consistent with what I thought was like the most mainline, mainstream title for that character. Also, another thing I did not take into account. For team books like Justice League and Avengers and Suicide Squad, I have that tracking like the Justice League movie and the Justice League comic, not like the Justice League movie and then Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman. It's team book to team comic, not team book to individual members that comprise that team. That could have an influence, I know, but for the purposes of this and to make it a little bit simpler, that's how I did it. As you can see, I've got all my freaking data here. Sometimes there's just nothing out that month for that character. So that could have an influence on overall sales, but if anything, that should just make whenever the movie comes out, should make that correlation a lot stronger for Shazam, for example. But yeah, I just wanted to see how comic movies affected this. And there's some stuff that's kind of obvious that you can see. Like I know with Guardians of the Galaxy in August 2014, took a spike a little bit. I think the average is around 55,000. Though in the months leading up to it, because I did do that, I lagged it 2 months ahead and behind to account for hype for the movie leading up to the release, and then like the 2 month theater run after the release. So that's the months that we're looking at as far as factoring in. I'll probably remember some more stuff that I thought was important as we kind of go along. But that's kind of, the 2 month lag forward and backward. And then everything else I mentioned that I did and did not include. So if we go to the actual data, this is my data here. So I'm going to do this kind of step by step and walk through what we're being shown. So first we're just going to run it on, this is just straight up comic book sales and was a movie released, yes or no. That's all, and we're looking at that comic book data, which I've formatted here a little bit differently. And then we give our output down here, and I'll see if I can make that a little bit bigger. So our output down here, this is what we're looking at, just the coefficient and the effect here. So the coefficient of whether a movie was released or not. Over here on the side, you can see the significance code. So 3 asterisks means extremely significant. So it's an extremely significant event for a comic book if there was a movie released. And to be clear, this is a movie of the same character being released. So this was a Batman. How does a Batman movie affect a Batman comic? Not just like, how does a Batman movie affect sales in general? It's like, no, this is for the character itself. Which again, the whole idea is, hopefully, I guess I can hide this. Hopefully, a comic book movie is bringing in new readers. So you see a Batman movie, you're like, that's awesome. Let me go buy a Batman comic. And just on movie release, we can see it is significant. It does have an effect, and that effect is whenever a movie is released, on average, you're looking at almost 6,000 more sales per month for a given title, which is honestly pretty good. I expected it to be not related at all, so that was good to see. So you could say that answers the question. There we go. We have an answer. Positive correlation. It does actually improve comic sales, but we have more data to look at than just that. Here we have, was a movie released, and was the movie a sequel? And if we look at that, we can see they are both significant. The movie released is more significant, but as long as it is significant, that's really what matters. And this was very interesting. So the movie being released has a positive almost 11,000 increase. The movie being a sequel has a negative almost 11,000 decrease. So it seems like if the movie released as a sequel, so take Captain America Winter Soldier, for example, it seems that it's kind of a net zero. There is no increase or decrease. Sequels seem to have a negative correlation. People, I guess, they've seen the character already. Maybe it's not their first introduction to the character. They've already seen it, so they're less likely to be wondering about it, perhaps. So they don't go and get it. is the only thing that I could really think of. If Guardians of the Galaxy comes out, that's the first time anyone's seen those characters. Sure, you're probably going to flock to buy the comic. By the time Guardians 2 comes out, you already know who they are. You've already checked them out. You decided if you like them or not. And so it's kind of a wash. The next one is going to be movie release. Is it a sequel? Oh, wait, no. This is movie release, and is the movie a reboot? So we're looking at like the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, Tom Holland Spider-Man. We're looking at the Christopher Nolan Batman movies or reboots to like the like Batman '89 and all that stuff. Let's see how that affects it. Again, both significant. And this one, you can see about 10,000 positively correlated with the movie being released, and 18,000 negatively correlated with it being a reboot. So you've got so for this, you have a net loss of about 8,000 comics a month whenever a reboot comic book movie comes out. So whenever Batman Begins comes out, on average, Batman comics are selling 8,000 less. And again, the reason for this, I think, is kind of what I just said with the sequel thing, is we've already seen the character. It's not something new being presented to us that maybe you're going to be curious about. We've seen it before. We already know what we're expecting. And so you wouldn't see an increase, in my opinion. Seeing the decrease is strange. And we'll talk about that kind of after all of this, is why I think there's a decrease here. Next one is going to be just, was a movie released, and was the movie did the movie have a audience score on Rotten Tomatoes of 70 or better, which on the Noble Comics Tanner rating scale, a 7 out of 10 or a 70 is where the threshold for a good movie, in my opinion, is. Like, it's a good movie, I would recommend it. So below that, I'd say not a good movie. We'll see here. Here, the Rotten Tomato score, that is negatively correlated, but it's not actually significant. So according to this, it has no effect. And the movie release is just up 8,000. Though I think, if I'm correct, you would still difference these, even though it's not significant, because you cannot have one without the other. You can't have a Rotten Tomatoes score without a movie being released. They're jointly tied together, which would bring us about to the same 5,000 figure, roughly, that we started out with just comic sales on movie release. So that makes sense to me. Let's see here. What's our next one? Our next one is going to be all of the movie information. Movie released, Rotten Tomato score, sequel, reboot. So it's all going to be together. What do we got? And here, same thing. Rotten Tomato scores, insignificant. Movie release and everything else is significant, though in this context, the sequel is less significant. The reboot is very significant. But again, we end up about where we did last time. So 14,000 positive, 16,000 negative, and then another almost 8,000 negative. So we're ending up, if a movie comes out, it's a sequel movie and it's a reboot. So Spider-Man Far From Home, right? That was the one with Mysterio. It would be an example of this. You're looking at it like a net loss of probably 10,000 Spider-Man comics sold that month. Then here, that's total sales, but on here, this is going to be everything. So all of our movie information that we just listed, and whether the comic was a #1 or a milestone issue. And my hypothesis at the beginning of this was that movie sales would be pretty insignificant, but the thing that would be the most significant is obviously, is the comic a #1? Is the comic a milestone? And this is what we got. So the only thing insignificant here is the Rotten Tomatoes score yet again, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't factor in a lot. Most Marvel movies were at a 70 or above. Some of the X-Men movies weren't, the DC movies weren't. But it doesn't seem to factor in very much at all. But let's see what we got here. So first of all, the #1 and the milestone, obviously hugely significant, way more significant than the others. And this is exactly what I would expect to see. Almost 80,000 on average more if it's a #1 issue, which makes sense, and then almost 70,000 more if it's a milestone issue, which also that makes sense. Nothing really surprising there. And then basically what we saw before, where our movie release and reboot figures are pretty much crossing out, and we're at a net loss of about 10,000 sales for the sequel movie. So looking at all that, obviously the #1 thing that's going to influence comic book sales are the comics themselves, whether they're a #1 issue, whether they're a milestone, and probably, if I factored it in, the creative teams as well. Movies, even whenever there's a good influence, the movie's influence is a lot smaller than these. And look, if it's a fresh new IP, not new IP, new for the movies, coming out, there was that increase of about 5,000 sales. You cannot deny that. But as soon as you start looking into sequel movies, reboot movies, stuff like that, it's usually a wash, if not a net negative correlation. And with Marvel today, we're seeing a lot more sequels, especially reboots, not as much, but a lot more sequels. DC's the same way right now. We're going to have a ton of reboots, a ton of sequels, which does not bode well for comic book sales, which are likely going to follow this trend of decreasing whenever those properties do come out. Now, like I said earlier, having it be a wash, I completely understand. Having it be a net loss is interesting. Why would that be? And one thing that I've kind of thought at looking at all this data is, what if comic books and comic book movies are not complements like you think they would be, right? You think that one would complement the other. If the sales of one are doing good, the sales of the other are doing good because they're the same characters, the same intellectual property. But that's not the case. I'm thinking maybe comic books and comic book movies are actually substitutes for one another. Because, you take it from an entertainment perspective. If you only have so much money to spend on entertainment, if you're spending it going to the movies, maybe you're not spending it on comics. And in this case, say it's a sequel and it's a reboot. As far as the movies are concerned, I'd say you're probably more likely to see it because it's a character that you're familiar with. It's a storyline that you know. You're already sold. You're into the second or third movie. You're already committed to seeing where the storyline goes. So that's what you're going to spend your money on, as opposed to comic books. So I think that's one reasonable theory that could help explain why we're looking at negative values here. Anything else that could really explain that? I don't think it would have anything to do with like fatigue, but maybe it's something like that. Like, hey, I've seen 15 Batman movies. I don't really feel like reading any Batman comics. That could be something like that. Or it even could be something like, the more that these movies progress and become mainstream, the less hardcore fans are going to watch them. It could be something like that. Like oh, I liked it before, it was cool. Now it's lame. Could be something like that. But I think it being a substitute rather than a complement probably works the best. Also because while they are the same characters, they are different to a not insignificant degree. Like, the Batman on screen is not the same as Batman in the comics. The storylines on screen are typically not taken very faithfully from the storylines of the comics. It is kind of its own thing, and maybe there is that disconnect between the source material and what's on screen that also leads to this sort of disconnect in success and sales between the two. But I mean, this is the raw data, again, taken straight from Comichron, Box Office Mojo, and this is it runs. I used to have the box office scores up here, and that was one of the things, but I took that out, so forget that. From Comichron and Rotten Tomatoes is really where all this data comes from. I'm going to see if I can link this data in a YouTube video or in the description. I've never done that before, but I can see if I can do that. And if you guys want to take a look at it, maybe I missed something, but this seems pretty reasonable to me. That if it is a single IP, it's new to the big screen from the comics, you're probably going to see an increased interest in that comic book property. Uh, but as soon as it's like a sequel, reboot, something established on the big screen, we're going to see a negative correlation with actual comic book sales. Yeah, I wanted to show that off. This was my capstone final project for my degree in economics. Wanted to show it off and let you guys know what I found. And let me know what you think, if this surprised you or not, and I'll see you in the next video.